Good, let's begin the session. A warm welcome to the virtual roundtable series of the SDG Taskforce of the Earth System Governance Project. This is the second roundtable on promises and pitfalls of accelerating SDG implementation. And today we will be focusing on national integration of the SDGs. My name is Sabine Weiland. I'm working at the Catholic University Lille in France. And I will be sharing this roundtable together with my dear colleague Montserrat Koloffon from the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands. We are the co-conveners of a working group on the SDG Taskforce, together with a third colleague, Ivonne Lobos Alva from the Stockholm Environment Institute, branch Latin America, who is based in Colombia. This working group on national integration of the SDGs has around 12 members, and we are happy and open to welcome further members. So if you're interested to participate, please drop us an email. Now, this roundtable is organized by our working group on national integration of the SDGs as part of the SDG task force. We have a very distinguished and diverse round of speakers in the roundtable from both within our working group and from the outside. Some of them come from an academic context, others are working in policy making, and in terms of geographical spread, they come also from all around the globe. So this is meant to be a rich and diverse discussion on various aspects of national implementation and integration of the SDGs. So thanks already to the participants of the roundtable for their availability to participate in this event. Now, in terms of proceeding, we will first invite all speakers to provide short inputs, so short reflections of 5 minutes or so based on their areas of expertise on the theme of accelerating SDG integration at the national level. And I will introduce our speakers as we go. And after this round of interventions from the panelists, we will have 30 minutes of discussion with questions and comments from the audience, and also from the panelists who are invited as well to comment on each other's contributions. My colleague Montserrat will be leading the discussion then. So if you have questions or comments while the speakers are presenting, feel free to put them in the chat, and then Montserrat will direct them to the speakers. So without further ado, let's start the round table. The first speaker is Mark Elder from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, Japan. He is the Director of Research and Publications in the Strategic Management Office there, and he has led various research projects on environmental and sustainability governance, including on the SDGs. So, Mark, the floor is yours to share some thoughts on the promises and pitfalls of accelerating SDG integration at the national level.
Yes, thank you very much, Sabine, for the kind introduction. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here today. Yeah, I have a few slides to share. And I guess to start out, I guess what I noticed during the discussions in our working group is that there are trying to make my, okay. Yeah, there are at least maybe 2 ways to think of national integration, and I'll comment maybe on both of them. One way of thinking about it is national integration as SDG implementation, regardless of whether that means integrated implementation or maybe silo-based implementation. And I guess the point I want to make based on my own research is that I do think that SDG governance research should focus more on concrete policies and national budgets, which are the key means of implementation. And this means concrete policies like laws and regulations on renewable energy or air pollution or public transport, et cetera. And what I've found in my research on VNRs is that, in fact, countries have many policies, but maybe they're not as ambitious enough or transformative enough and may not be well implemented or well funded. I think a lot of research on the VNRs tends to focus maybe on everything except for policies. I mean, goal attainment is okay, but there's a lot on, for example, participation in the VNR process. So, I mean, in my understanding, the original idea for civil society organizations to monitor implementation was to look at what the countries are actually doing. But anyway, I'm not really sure how much of this has been done before. And the reality is countries have a lot of policies. Maybe all of the country's policies are related to SDGs in one way or another, but we need to, I think, look more at concrete policy areas. And then maybe another way to think about national integration is in terms of integrated approaches. Our countries, because the SDGs are supposed to be an integrated system, and are they using this more or not, or are SDGs helping? And I think there's a kind of a debate or tension in SDGs about, like especially about whether we need a more holistic approach, which is actually kind of difficult, or prioritization. And I think for Earth system governance, the conclusion is that really environmental sustainability needs to be the priority. And this is really the lesson of the Earth system boundaries, planetary boundaries literature. And otherwise, the environmental crises threaten our social and economic objectives. But on the other side, I mean, it can't be just about the environment, but in our environmental measures, we need to focus on a just transition. So the environmental measures need to serve social and economic objectives, particularly jobs. And so for how to integrate these, we need to think more about an integrated approach in terms of combining Earth systems and human systems, because SDGs themselves, I mean, there's integration in there, but it's kind of scattered because it's a political document. And then in terms of the theme of this roundtable, I think we're supposed to think about how to make implementation more ambitious. And so my thought on that relates to the suggestion to think about how to institutionalize environmental sustainability in national policy making. And the current mechanisms we have for this are, for example, environment ministries or environmental impact assessments, et cetera. But and obviously these measures are not enough, although they're better than in the 50s, but we know environment ministries are weak, and they don't, and it's the economic ministries that influence the policies. And anyway, the political leaders are not really persuaded about environmental priority in many countries. So my suggestion is to consider how institutionalization of other key ideas in other policy areas. So for example, like central banks, institutionalize monetary policy autonomy, because raising interest rates to fight inflation is not politically popular either, but somehow the government's established independent institutions like central banks to enable that to happen. And my other favorite example is that, like in the US, the Office of Management and Budget has an Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and they screen all regulations. In the past, this has been used actually maybe to screen out environmental regulations as being too costly for business, and it promotes basically deregulation and low cost for business. But and the national government could have a sustainability office that screens all regulations and policies to make them more sustainable instead of more neoliberal. Anyway, I think maybe that's enough ideas for now. I think my 5 minutes are up, and I'll stick to the deadline or timeline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for these interesting thoughts. I can confirm that we had quite some discussions in our working group around the relation between national integration and implementation, which are kind of related, but also can be distinguished in conceptual terms, but also in empirical terms. And thanks for these interesting thoughts and details regarding some of the dimensions that should be taken into consideration. So we move on to the next speaker in the round table, Esther Sedlacek. She is a Marie Curie PhD scholar at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Esther is part of the Adapted program, where she explores the synergies, trade-offs, and interlinkages between climate commitments and sustainable development goals. And there's specifically SDG 1, no poverty, in the context of sub-Saharan African countries. And Esther, we are curious to hear your thoughts on a national integration of the SDGs. The floor is yours, Esther.
Thank you so much, Sabina. Very nice introduction. This is exactly what I do. So I would like to emphasize that national integration of the SDGs is extremely crucial, but I think the national integration of SDGs across the goals themselves is equally or even more crucial. And I will have the following three main points regarding this. That integration into the national system is across the SDGs based on interlinkages that are also based on governance arrangement and impact. Second, that we cannot view the SDGs in a policy and political vacuum without understanding the political economic context. And three, that there are still very ample opportunities for us. So we should not look at this topic completely negatively, but focus maybe on the synergistic solutions in governance arrangements and SDGs that we see. So I will start with the first point, that integration into the national governance system is important, but it is equally important to translate the global goals into the national context, but without reinforcing the already existing conflicts and trade-offs among the goals. So rather, let's try to resolve these conflicts and trade-offs should be the main idea that guides national integration of the SDGs, from the global agenda to the national level and also to subnational levels. Well, several authors have argued that there are inherent goal conflicts conceptually between the SDGs, namely between economic growth and environmental goals. And evidence points towards the direction that countries, based on these dichotomies and goal conflicts, tend to cherry pick among the goals and across the goals and only design policies and implement them or include them into their national agendas based on what they prioritize on their interest. And this means that while countries may be succeeding in one of the SDGs, but this may come at the expense of another SDG. So while there are increasingly efforts to reduce these incoherences, the challenges still remain. For example, in my own research in sub-Saharan Africa, I have observed that there is still, although decreasing, but there is still a perceived dichotomy between this economic growth, fossil fuel-based economic growth, or poverty reduction narrative, and the environmental goals. So in this kind of understanding, it would be interesting to see what kind of governance arrangements at the institutional, organizational level, as Mark mentioned, but also at the level of concrete policies, policy integration, and goals exist, also in terms of discourse that either facilitate or hinder the understanding of SDG and implementation of SDG interlinkages. Now, there may be persistent factors at the institutional and the organizational level, but some coherences can be observed at the goal level, at the national level, but their implementation is largely not taking place. So this is quite important because several authors, for example, in South Africa, have observed that while at the level of goals in national plans, there may be a tendency to be coherent, their implementation is not taking place due to political economy factors, and that governments prioritize economic growth, and this often includes fossil fuel-based development. So there is also a need to focus on the broader level when thinking about the national integration across goals and into the national system. Because shifting development pathways, for example, is a crucial element of nationally integrating all of the SDGs together and not in a siloed manner. And second, I would also argue that in both a global north and a global south context, while the organizational and institutional level is extremely important, without understanding the political economic factors, we will not succeed in implementing the SDGs and their interlinkages. So these are completely essential factors to understand. Of course, my research focuses on the global south context in sub-Saharan Africa, so that is all I can speak about, where it is predominant, the political economic factors, both historically and also in contemporary manners, and both within the country, but also at a macro level based on the country's own embeddedness into the global economic system. So focusing on the micro level, the within country level of the political economy, what we see is that it can be an extremely important enabling or hindering factor. This means that even if there are windows of opportunity, for example, decreasing prices of renewable energy or increasing projects or even coal divestment from international actors, if there is a local competing interest to sustain fossil fuel-based development or coal, this will be extremely difficult to pick away from and kind of include this into the SDG implementation. What we also see is that political economic factors also matter in kind of institutional and policy integration as well. So they have very overarching effects and can really, really hinder, but also support the implementation, the joint implementation of SDGs. And the third note is that we could say positive about the interlinkages because there are several advancements on how to implement several SDGs at the same time. For example, the JETP partnership that exists between South Africa and actually based on this pattern or a sample in other countries as well, which are relying on fossil fuel-based development and coal. And these partnerships, they really aim to bring in multiple stakeholders in jointly addressing poverty reduction, energy, and climate. And these are more and more used in national policy settings to kind of implement the shift away from fossil fuel-based development, which is the core of the SDGs, I would say. And of course, an example of this, as I mentioned, is the JETP in South Africa, which is quite a positive example, I would say, but still critics very much argue that, that the implementation will not take place as planned in the document. And while these notable words of reinforcing the joint implementation of several of these SDGs, while it is there and it is quite notable, but it is only words and it will not translate into action, and that there are no sufficient means to or capacity to kind of implement national level sectoral plans jointly. So while there are positive advancements, I would say that we really have to be careful about these transitions because from a justice perspective, it can be quite challenging, I would say. And a lot of scholars and experts argue that the just energy transitions may be implementing several of the SDGs at the same time, but this comes at the price of local justice, which is also the case in terms of global and national differences. When, for example, there are mines in sub-Saharan Africa and in the global south, where the local circumstances are quite unjust and very negative in terms of a social perspective, but it is supplying the demand for the green transition globally. So I think we need to be wary of these kind of circumstances, but if we can design and also implement solutions at the national level which would work. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, for these interesting reflections around issues of interlinkages. What I noted is that much of the discourse around sustainable development goals is on these synergies and co-benefits theme, and the conflicts, of course, are more in the background, but we can still argue that these are the more important and more challenging aspects to tackle and to address. And thanks for your interesting insights into how that is discussed more concretely or empirically, let's say, in the cases that you are studying, including the political dimension that comes in, political will, and justice questions and other questions. So thank you very much, Esther, for this intervention. We move on to the next speaker, which is who's Bob Webb. He is associate professor at the Australian National University, and they're affiliated with the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, and also the Fenner School of Environment and Society. He there pursues research on climate adaptation with a focus on better linking adaptation practice, policy, and research. Bob has also carried out research in the areas of sustainable urban development and on transformational change and transdisciplinary processes. And in your intervention today, Bob, you will be focusing on SDG integration in Australia and on the question how to move to a more sustainable path to deliver the SDGs in that context. So Bob, the floor is yours. Bob, we cannot hear you. Could you unmute your microphone, please?
That better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Sorry about that, pretty fundamental mistake. Yes, so I want to talk about the promises and pitfalls from an Australian perspective. And I'll say a few words first about the current status on the SDGs for Australia. It currently does exceed performance on many of the SDG targets, but it's also below expectations in many. According to the most recent 2023 SDSN report, it ranked 40th out of 166 countries assessed, and they were assessed according to the extent they were on track to meet the 2030 outcomes based on their performance since 2015 to date. And 5 goals posing the most significant challenges for Australia in the assessment were food and nutrition, sustainable consumption and production, climate change, life on land, and developing partnerships. Overall, this makes it fairly typical, but just below average of other high-income countries in terms of progress. Moving to some of the promises for acceleration, those who've looked at Australia's performance from an integrated perspective have shown that it is possible conceptually for Australia to move to a more sustainable development path, including delivery on the SDGs, provided it follows some key overall national policy directions. And I'll just mention a few of those. First of all, to treat the SDG agenda as a significantly increased and long-term investment agenda, which the national government needs to lead. Secondly, that this investment would require the national government to increase taxes significantly to finance the investment from where they are now, along with sector-related policy measures. Thirdly, in regard to policy measures, the most effective approach in regard to the policy measures is one that focuses on a smaller number, say 5 to 6 key transformation programs rather than 17 individual goals. This because it provides a mission-based focus and also makes evaluation of the major synergies and trade-offs between the goals and proposed policies more manageable. Fourthly, it needs to translate the SDG goals and targets into the Australian context so that they best address local needs and aspirations while also at least meeting the SDGs. The policy mixes adopted need to be coherent and thoughtfully sequenced to bring about social buy-in as well as economic and environmental transitions. Now, when you think about that set of potentialities, there are also some pitfalls, at least in the Australian context. And the reality of recent and current socio-politics in the country, rather like Esther was just talking about from a political economy point of view, creates big barriers that would need to be overcome to implement such accelerators. First of all, Australia has had 10 years of a conservative government, including climate denialists, for example, and has had no discourse on the SDGs at all. A new, more progressive government came to power, but only 1 year ago, at last addressing climate and energy, but in most other areas, they are focused on meeting short-term social pressures, of which there are quite a few, and election commitments rather than the medium longer term SDG agenda. A second issue is the idea of raising taxes, as was mentioned as a possible necessary condition. And it has become a political and electoral liability in recent years in Australia, with any serious tax reform still currently off the agenda. And Australia has a 3-year election cycle which mitigates against longer-term actions. Thirdly, there is likely to be political resistance to translating and being held accountable to the broad range of SDG goals into explicit goals and targets in the national context. The only explicit longer-term goals and targets set by governments to date have been in just a few specific areas, i.e. targets bridging the gap for Indigenous people's outcomes in Australia and the new government's movement on climate and energy goals and targets. Fourthly, there are still significant government policy and practice silos in place to prevent the more integrated, coherent policy solutions from being developed and implemented, picking up again on part of Esther's point. And finally, the movement of all the above are difficult enough that they need a serious national discourse on the SDGs, and that is not happening nationally at the moment. On an optimistic note, the new national government is looking at introducing a broader well-being rather than just economic focus to the budget and outcomes processes, and there are significant pockets of SDG enthusiasm at the subnational levels. Now, these are just some of the potentials and pitfalls for accelerating the SDGs in an Australian context. There are others, but the overall point I would make is that Australia is just one example of how national SDG acceleration is contingent on a range of country-specific starting positions and socio-political contingencies, so that a richer understanding of these contexts is needed to draw out the broader conclusions that are quite important. Thanks. Back to you, Sabine.
Thank you, Bob, for this interesting reflection on the Australian example of national integration and implementation of the SDGs. What I take away is, of course, that there is these national, as you say, national political contingencies to be taken into account. And for me, what came also out of your reflections is the need to set priorities which go beyond that attitude to choose the easiest option, which is often called cherry picking, but to, within the kind of given framework, to formulate a work program that is still aspirational, and how to set it up in a way that, well, transformation can be fostered or promoted. Thank you again, Bob. We move on to the next speaker of the roundtable, Valentina Botero. She is working in the National Planning Department in Colombia, so different part of the world again. And we are also moving now to a policymaker's perspective, because Valentina is working in the Public Policy Monitoring and Evaluation Directorate. She is an SDG monitoring advisor. So Valentina, you have first-hand insights into national implementation and integration of the SDGs in Colombia, and we are very eager to hear your thoughts and reflections. So Valentina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. As you mentioned, I'm part of the follow-up team for the implementation of the agenda in Colombia. So I would like to share a little of Colombian experience in the implementation of the agenda and our lines of action. And I'm going to focus in the 4th line that we have, and I will mention later that is about the dialogue with multiple development actors. So Colombia has had a leadership and defining and promoting the 2030 agenda, and that have made possible to design an institutional framework for the implementation of the SDG in the country. So with this, we have establishing like a specific goals linking to the state actions to fulfill the Agenda 2030. So with this, we recognize that it's like necessary to work intensively to measure like the public policies and to contribute with the mobilization of resources and actors for effectively implementing the SDGs. So we recognize that it's essential to have like strategic alliances and to identify the challenges and opportunities that we have year after year. So our national SDG policy defines a strategy for the implementation of the SDG in Colombia, and it has 4 lines of action. So the first one is tracking a reporting scheme. The second one is to strengthen the data production. The third one is the implementation of the SDG at subnational level. And the 4th one is the mobilization of different stakeholders and financial resources. So these 4 lines are like the strategic lines that we chose to implement the goals and to program like the budget of the government and to have like all the implementation of programs and projects and to make the evaluation and the accountability of all these actions. Regarding to the stakeholders engagement, that is the 4th line that I mentioned, we part from the basis that not actors like on their own can make like the agenda a reality. So we have to involve all the actors from the development to accelerate the achieving of the agenda. And we have made like some progress in this strategic. So we launched the multi-stakeholder mechanism last year. So the SDG multi-stakeholders platform is the official name for this mechanism. Is a long-term, like a regular and continuous dialogue with other actors of the development, because we recognize that it's important not only to speak from the government, but to involve other actors in this platform. Participate the private sector, the organized civil society, the international cooperation, the academia, and the Congress of Colombia. And the main goal of this mechanism is to promote and strengthen the appropriation and the capacity for action around the 2030 agenda. In this platform, we develop some initiatives and projects with the participation of all these actors, and we exchange good practices. We also contribute to the review of the national voluntary reports and the local reports. And we are trying to engage with all these actors and to promote the confidence between them to make more actions around the agenda, and to see that if we get together, we can like achieve the SDGs like easier. So this platform has an executive committee, and this committee has already had like 5 sessions. And in these sessions, we get together and we share some priorities that they have like identified. So the main challenge that we have now in this platform is how to define those priorities now, because we have actors for all over like the country, and sometimes they are working in several projects. It's been really hard to identify how that can be connected with the priorities from the government. So now we have like defined 2 main like objects that we think that are like align with the government, that are the financing topic and the territorialization topic. But the idea is to keep working in like establishing working groups in order to have like a continuous process to identify those kind of subjects, and to like start to make like products that we can share, and to have like a real like paper, something to give to the government for order like to go to many places and share all these concerns. So I think this mechanism for us has been like a great step in order to implement the agenda. However, we have like many challenges. Even we are going to participate in the high-level political forum with this mechanism, and we are going to share some challenges that we have identified as the difficult to define concrete products to generate and to focus in issues that we can prioritize as like everybody is engaged with. So we are currently defining those priorities. We have some working groups, and I think this can be like a real like a great advance to approach the agenda. Even as you mentioned like before in some of the interventions, we need to involve all the development actors, but it's like a really hard work to get for them to participate like in active way, because everybody is just saying that the government has to do this or this, but it's really hard when you sit down with them and ask them what they want to do. So we are in that process, and yes, that's like the experience that we have for now in this line of multi-stakeholders approach.
Thank you very much, Valentina, for these insights from a policy and policymaker's perspective. And yeah, I can well imagine that the issue or a challenge of defining priorities is a key one in your and in any strategic process regarding implementation or putting into practice the SDGs. And I guess that there will be some questions also, and I have some of my own regarding your kind of assessment of real life, real world processes. Good, but let's move on first to the last speaker of the round table, Zakaria Tsundi, from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. He is based in Canada. Zakaria is a policy advisor with the IISD's Tracking Progress team. And you are working on frameworks to measure national and also international progress, including on metrics for the assessment of some form of comprehensive wealth. So this work is meant to move beyond the GDP, the gross domestic product, as the traditional measure for accessing prosperity, which is arguably not so appropriate for achieving the SDGs and sustainable development in general. So Zakaria, curious to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Sabine. I'm closing the show. Yeah, the discussion around beyond GDP falls into the enablers and constraints around the SDGs, and that is going to be what I'm going to discuss today. Why this is important? Because those constraints and the enablers, they define the speed at which we are moving along the sustainability path. Now, part of the reasons we are still making slow progress is our short-term thinking, which is highly focused on gross domestic product. And this is like a pothole on roads. If you have a lot of potholes, you'll probably move at a slow pace. So we have to change this mindset if we want to achieve the SDGs. We have to change the way we think about growth the way we think about expansion and also our conception of progress. Why there is so much concern around GDP? What's wrong with GDP? Well, there's several reasons. In fact, GDP fails to capture a lot of issues that underpin sustainability and well-being of the society. We can talk about climate change, environmental degradation, household debt, gender issues, inequality. These are all really important. These are very important components of society, of progress of society. But unfortunately, GDP doesn't account for those. Another example comes from UN Women, who estimated that during COVID-19, women spent more than 500 billion hours globally to do additional unpaid childcare work. Unfortunately, when we talk about growth, we talk about expansion, we don't mention those, and this is a serious problem. On the other hand, when you look at activities such as deforestation, overfishing, or burning of fossil fuels, and other harmful practices, these are the ones that usually contribute to increasing GDP. Another example comes from the trend of GDP over time. When you look at the trend from 1970 up to now, GDP almost doubled. But at the same time, the depletion of our natural resources more than tripled, with all these consequences for the environment and future generations. So the issue here is not the expansion itself, it's about the way we think about growth, the way we think about this expansion, and more importantly, the cost of that expansion. So if you want to make this progress towards the SDG and ensure long-term prosperity, we have to make this fundamental shift in the way we measure and we think about progress. Making this shift doesn't mean we have to replace GDP completely. In fact, GDP will still be important in policy making. What we mean here is to have new metrics that better reflect what we mean by expansion and that truly reflect a societal progress. For that reason, the UNSG, the Secretary General, recently published a policy brief inviting countries to move beyond GDP by developing new, concise, widely accepted, statistically sound, and robust measure to complement GDP. And among these potential new metrics, the SG mentioned, highlighted comprehensive or inclusive wealth, which is composed of 5 main capitals: human capital, natural capital, social capital, produce or physical capital, or in short, infrastructure, and financial capital. Those 5 assets are truly the ones that underline well-being and that drive a failure or a success of society. We can mention a few examples, including healthy ecosystems, strong communities, educated citizens, or sound financial holdings. These are all components of comprehensive wealth that underpin the well-being of the society. Now, what's the link with the SDGs? While the SDGs are a set of goals to reach by 2030, measuring and working on improving comprehensive wealth will create these better enabling conditions to achieve those goals by shifting our concept of growth and creating more balanced decision-making between short-term and long-term policy options. Because the reason we're making this slow progress is that we have this market idea, this market conception that is always pushing us towards a high reliance on GDP, which is quite a problem because we're making short-term decisions. We're not giving too much priority to long-term impacts of every action we are doing now. As a final remark, the Summit of the Future next year is a unique opportunity for national stakeholders and the international community to foster dialogue and address the pressing global challenges, including the SDGs. The UNSG, along with other leaders such as the World Bank, the UNEP, the OECD, the World Economic Forum, to mention just a few, they're all inviting countries to move beyond GDP. So it's very important for all countries to start taking a step now. And ISD is working with countries across the world to make this shift happen. Thanks. I hope I didn't go too long.
Thank you, Zakaria. No, perfect in terms of the timing. And thank you for the interesting reflections on an even more, let's say, practical dimension, namely on the tools that are needed to achieve any form of SDG or the SDGs, or any form of transformation towards the SDGs, in that you argue that new metrics are required, which are comprehensive and inclusive forms of not only growth but wealth and prosperity of society. Yeah, thank you very much to the 5 speakers of this round table. We now have about 15 minutes left for the discussion, and I will give the floor to my colleague Montserrat, who is leading on that part of the event. Montserrat.
Thank you so much, Sabine, and thank you everyone for these insightful interventions. Indeed, we have just over 10 minutes for some questions. We already have 2 in the chat, and I know there are many more than we can possibly address. I had my own, but I'm going to prioritize and start with those that have been shared by the audience. The first one is from our co-lead of the working group, Ivonne, and it is for Valentina. And she wants to know, from a government's perspective, what is something that you would like the science community to support? How can scientists better support governments to advance the SDG implementation? And here I want to add a bit my sauce, as we say in Mexico. So I would say how to do that without also falling in the risk of overly technocratizing the SDG implementation.
Yes, I was reading the question, and I think it's a really hard one because we are in that process of identify how to work with multiple actors. Even we are working now with academia, and even with Ivonne, with the platform, and we are trying to see how can we work together. And for example, with science and academia, we are trying to see how can that help us with accountability. As I mentioned before, I think the agenda cannot be achieved if we doesn't have like accountability from an outsider point of view. If we only do it from the government, we cannot do it. So I think all these part we can get help if they help us to see if indicators are working, if we can establish new indicators, how those indicators are working in some areas of the country, and also to see if we are accomplishing the agenda in a good way, if we are going to the good track, and if the journey that we are making is working for all the national territory, because sometimes we just focus on the capital, and that's really hard to see how it's getting involved other areas of the country. So yes, I think it's a working in process, but we are trying to get there to see how can we involve all the actors, and how can we work together and to have like a better implementation of the agenda.
Thank you so much, Valentina. And this is a topic dear to my heart, since in my own research, I focus also on multi-stakeholder partnerships. But in view of time, I'm going to jump immediately to the next question from the audience. And this is for Zakaria. And the question is from someone who I assume is in Ireland, because they say, is there a risk that well-being frameworks deprioritize or erase the importance of development assistance aid. And then the example is that in Ireland, the well-being framework doesn't account for spillover effects as in line with SDG 17.
Thanks. This is quite a great question. I don't think it's going to be it's going to pose a challenge in terms of our foreign aid, simply because we have to think through the reason aid exists. That is to support other countries in the challenges they're facing. And yes, these well-being frameworks, there's few countries started to implement, and the work is still in progress. And after the 2024 Summit of the Future, we might come up with something more globally, which is going to allow cross countries comparison, and several issues will be incorporated in those framework. So the reason foreign aid is provided is to address other countries' challenges. So if other countries are also measuring their well-being through, let's say, comprehensive wealth, and there are a few issues, let's say, on one of the pillars, infrastructure or natural capital, which is a very important component of wealth, then that sends a signal to all countries across the globe, in the sense that if that challenge is not addressed, then the impact is going to be reflected on other countries in terms of climate issues. So it's going to raise a concern globally, and that's why I truly believe foreign aid will still exist, although the component of that aid might shift.
Great, thank you so much. And there's a follow-up question from Megan, also in the chat, as you will see. But I'm tempted to jump to the next question to give someone else the opportunity to ask. And if you could address that one in the chat, it would be great. So Marianne asks, Germany has set up 7 so-called TTs, which stands for transformation teams, along the GSDR 2019, 6 entry points to transformation. This has been to overcome the siloed approach to implementation. Now, each of these transformation teams is made up of several line ministries. And the idea is good, but the coordination takes a lot of time and capacity. This is actually interesting because it's also a question I wanted to ask to Mark. So the question itself is, do you know of any literature that evaluates such efforts and discusses good practices? And the way I was going to phrase it was a little bit more, let's say, challenging or maybe, thought-provoking, whether this idea of holistic implementation in the current setup of ministries that we have, whether it is a bit of a trap and that we should be focusing elsewhere. So anyone who wants to jump in, but maybe Mark, you want to give it a go?
Okay, sure. Yes, I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm not really sure about the existing literature. I think it's very hard to avoid ministries. I mean, I think you can reorganize them, and you can maybe create a new ministry or combine other ministries, and I guess this has been tried many times over the years, maybe to coordinate other issues too, like when a war is going on. That is another challenge of coordinating ministries when you're trying to fight a war or maybe recover from an earthquake. I guess, but the other thing I noticed is that in the scientific community, we point our fingers and tell governments, you have to coordinate, but actually we don't really have a clear idea, I think, of exactly how they're supposed to do this. We just tell them that they should, and just do it. And so I do think that more research is needed on this. I mean, probably we have to maybe let the ministries work in their silos, but maybe that's the scientific community has to maybe do the coordinating and explain what needs to be coordinated. I guess that's my current intuition. Thanks.
Thanks so much, and also for that answer that touches on the question that Yvonne had raised. Bob, you have something to add?
Just add something to what Mark said there, sure, if I can. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that gives me optimism in that Australian context I was talking about is that the academic community, the science community has done quite a lot of work around that sort of interdependency thing in the Australian context, specifically evaluating what it would be. So when I said it seems to be feasible for Australia, in our case, to move towards a more sustainable environment, that was based largely not so much on government work, but on academic work. And the issue is, of course, how to get the two to meet. I think the optimism comes not only from the fact there is quite a lot of science expertise, if you like, or science in knowledge sense expertise in Australia, but also from, picking up on Zachariah's point, the fact that the Treasury function in Australia, which is a central agency, which is probably the most powerful one in the Australian context, and that's often the case in some countries, has committed to looking at this well-being concept. And the current treasurer, for example, is a political economist, not an economist, and clearly is bringing some of that perspective in as well. So I think it's no one measure. I think it's a confluence of things that can make the science and the government and the community, because that's where the discourse comes in. At the moment, the broader community has not really been engaged by the national government. And I think it's only when you start to get that going collectively and by the way, that some of that academic work has specifically picked up on the 6 entry points work that was referred to in the question and used that as a framing to indicate how it would be quite feasible to use that as a vehicle for greater collaboration between the key agencies on specific transformational issues. So to me, you've got to have a number of the ducks lined up in order to make things come together, because all those inputs are needed, including from the society. And that's where the discourse is so important.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I'm sure, when you have people focusing on same topics, same interests in the same room, we could continue talking for the rest of the afternoon. We also got an extra question in the chat that I'm terribly sorry we can no longer address in view of time, but maybe we can continue the conversation outside of this forum. I'm going to give the floor back to Sabine for some closing remarks, but on my behalf, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thanks from my side as well to everybody for attending the webinar. We are strictly respecting the time frame of 60 minutes here. I think that was a very interesting discussion of some of the challenges and pitfalls and maybe also promises of national integration of the SDGs. Thanks to everyone for your interesting contributions. Thanks to our panelists for their interventions from very different perspectives. I think that was a very rich discussion. The Roundtable series of the SDG Taskforce continues, I think in September, with a roundtable organized by the Working Group on Subnational Implementation of the SDGs. So this discussion can also be taken forward or continued there. For now, thanks again. I wish you a good rest of the day or a good night wherever you are in the world. And I hope to see you again on the next occasion and the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.